an introduction to cloud computing in the last class, right? That was about 2 weeks ago, just understanding the concept of cloud computing. And today we're going to look into one of the cloud computing vendors. It's a big player in the cloud computing space. That's AWS. And AWS has a certification called the Cloud Solution Architect. So we'll look at what that certification course entails, and the things we need to learn in order to be certified cloud solution architect, right? So this is a very interesting section, I would say, of this course. So this is our course outline. We have 6 modules within this course, and each of those modules will take 1 module per week, because there's a lot to cover on each of them. So we wouldn't want to just bombard you with information. We'll take 1 module per week, which will enable us assimilate the content, right, and be able to try it out on our own, and just become more familiar with these things, right? So we'll start with the identity and access management module, then we'll move on to the introduction to Amazon S3, then the networking module, then high availability and scalability, the AWS relational database, and lastly, the AWS well-architected framework. Now, like I mentioned, the AWS Certified Solutions Architect, by the way, if you're putting some things in the chat right now, I might not be able to look at it, just because I'm on a different screen as I speak through the slides. But when it comes to the question answer session, if it hasn't been answered already by Tumilara or any of our other engineers, then I would speak on it, right? So you can also save your questions regarding anything I'm going to talk about to the question answer session, so I can engage with them or put them in the chat and someone else will pick them up, right? So AWS does have a course called, and a course and a certification called AWS Certified Solutions Architect Associates, right? So a solutions architect is someone that's, like the name says, designs solutions, cloud solutions. A cloud solutions architect designs solutions that enable companies or enterprises to run the application, to build their infrastructure, right? And the associate course here showcases the knowledge and skills in AWS technology across a wide range of AWS services. It doesn't cover all AWS services because AWS has a lot of services, but it covers the ones that a cloud solutions architect is expected to be familiar with, in order to design, cost-effective and performance solutions, right? So the focus of this certification rather, is on the design of cost optimized and performance optimized solutions. You are supposed to be able to demonstrate a strong understanding of the well-architected framework, which we'll come to at some point in this course. This certificate is one I first did, I think, about maybe 4 years ago or so. It was a very fun certification, right? It was one of the very exciting ones for me, just reading, learning, understanding what it means to build performance and cost-effective solutions on AWS. Right, so this certificate can enhance your career profile a lot, because once someone sees that you are able to pass, maybe an employer sees you're able to pass the solutions architect associate, they are sure that you have sufficient understanding, at least at an associate level, to be able to design solutions that stand the test of time, solutions that would help them save costs, solutions that will be highly available, that will be, secure, that will be reliable, and all those other things, right? So the certification has the ability to enhance your career profile and the earnings that you get from, opportunities that come your way due to this certification. It increases your credibility, right? And, the confidence that people have in you, whoever is engaging you, they already have a confidence that you know what you are doing, right? So the exam covers various domains. It covers designing, and the different domains have different weightings. I'll explain that. The first domain is designing secure architectures, right? So when we build on the cloud, we don't just build what works, we build what is secure, what cannot be broken into, what can be trusted. We build architectures that can be trusted, right? It's like you build a house, but you are done with a wonderful 10-story building, but it doesn't have any locks on the door, for instance, right? That's it looks beautiful, but practically it is not the best, right? Because it's not secure. So we build architectures that are secure, build architectures that are resilient, right? That's domain 2. Domain 3, look at designing high-performing architectures, right? The things that give clients the best user experience and that give the stakeholders, which are maybe the people you're working for, the people engaging you, gives them, the best performance on their sites. Then finally, domain 4 speaks about cost optimization, right? Making sure that we're building architectures that are not bogus in terms of cost, because if your application costs more than the revenue, if there's a higher cost for your architecture than the revenue you are bringing in, that company would run at a loss. So we want to know how to build cost optimized architectures, and they have different weightings. Like I said, weightings just means that the amount of questions you would have as regards a particular domain is different from the other one, right? And the amount of marks given to questions from a particular domain is different from the other one. So domain 1 has the highest weighting, 30% of the scored contents, to 26%, and so on and so forth. So you can find more info about these exams. I'll put it in the chat just so we can, we can even look at it while we're speaking, right? You can find more info about this exam here. I'm sure you see it on your portal also, right? Just to have an idea of what that looks like. But that's just introducing you to that exam. So the exam is great, but the more important thing is you being able to have the knowledge and the practical experience to use these skills in a working environment, right? So since we've covered all this, we'll just dive deep into the main topics for today. So one of the first things we'll be speaking about is users and groups in IAM, right? So remember, IAM refers to identity and access management, right? So identity and access management, like we talked about in the last class, is just a way of ensuring that the users have permissions to only what they need to have permissions to. Is a secure identity layer within AWS where you're able to assign, create users, create groups, assign them the appropriate permissions as they need, right? So it's just like, imagine IAM as a company security department who ensures that the right people have the appropriate access to the tools and data that they need. You don't want to be giving a junior employee, for instance, access to the salary spreadsheets of senior managers or something like that, right? You ensure that people in in certain departments have access to certain things related to their department. So that segmentation is what creates security within cloud platforms. So IAM is at the heart of all this, right? So when you create on AWS, when you create an AWS account, it always has something called a root account, right? Or a root user, right? And that root user is like the master key to your entire AWS account. That root user cannot be deleted, right? And that root user has, the highest access amongst everybody, every other user on your account. So just like you wouldn't, if you have a master key for your house, you would protect it, you would guard it, you wouldn't just give everyone to use. You wouldn't give your child to use. You make a copy, right, of that key, or you create certain keys for certain doors, right? Rather than having one key that opens all the doors. The root user is like that one key that opens all the doors. So you would want to have specific keys for specific doors. The same thing here. You are not advised to even use or share the root user credentials with anybody. And by credentials, I mean the username and the password, right? The username for the root user would usually be the email address with which you use to create the AWS account. And of course, the password is whatever you set at the password. So the root user is mainly needed, or is created for the initial setup of your AWS account and to handle account level settings only. So there are some things you would need to do on your AWS account. Maybe you need to, add new users. Since when you create the account, you have just one user. Of course, you need to add new users. You can use that's an account level setting. Maybe you need to add something called another organization. Maybe you need to do something that is just very high up in terms of permissions, right? You would need the root user to do that. Now, in order to work within the AWS environment, you create other users and give them certain permissions. So users represent individual people within your organization that need access to AWS services, right? They can be like employees in your company. Each of them has, their job descriptions. They have certain tools they need to work. Maybe someone just needs access to EC tools only. Someone needs access to S3s only or RDS only. Whatever it is, whatever services, whatever permissions, whatever combination of permissions that are needed, they are assigned to a user or a group, which we'll talk about next. So a user is just an individual person that needs access to AWS services. A group, on the other hand, is a collection of users. It's just used to simplify access management, right? So a group is it's kind of like a container, right? Where you put multiple users into. It's the same thing in maybe you have, it's just the same way you have departments in an organization. You have the HR department, you have the operations departments and all the likes. So those are groups that have certain individuals within those groups. So same thing here. It just helps you organize users by the role, and it helps you manage their permissions at a group level rather than individually. So if you have many users that require similar permissions, instead of assigning permissions individually and doing kind of like a duplication of effort, you can just create one group and put multiple users in that group and assign whatever permissions are needed by all those users to the group, right? So groups can only contain users, not other groups, right? You cannot add a group to a group. They can only contain users. And users can belong to multiple groups, right? Similar to how an employee might be part of multiple project teams or might be part of multiple departments in a company for one reason or the other, right? Users do not have to belong to a group. That's another thing. A user can just be on its own. It can just be a standalone user with specific permissions. And I'll show that as we go on. We'll do a little demo and see all those kind of things, right? So that kind of user can just be like a contractor, someone that is not part of any department, was just brought in to do certain tasks, and it's just a standalone user. Person comes into your account, does those tasks, and when it's done, it's removed, right? But it's usually more preferable when you have a group for a users or for a set of users so that you can easily manage them than having standalone users. So within the DevOps, because everything we're saying still ties into our DevOps culture, right? Within the DevOps culture, identity and access management plays a critical role in automating and securing our environments, right? So in DevOps, we would do a lot of automation, we'll write scripts and all that. Those scripts, those automation tools would need permissions to access resources on AWS without manual intervention. We can't always, go and be clicking, oh yes, allow this one anytime it wants to run. You need to be able to, as a DevOps engineer, you need to be able to determine what permissions these tools will need, then assign those permissions to those tools, right? And always keep in mind ensuring that the principle of the principle of least privilege is followed when assigning those permissions. That means you only assign little permissions as needed, as is needed by that particular user. You don't over assign permissions so that you don't, cause security breaches within your AWS accounts, right? One thing I forgot to mention here is identity and access management is a service, right? It's a service on AWS, and it's a global service. And what that means is that it's not tied to a specific region. There are services in AWS that are per region. That means if you make changes to that service, you create maybe some resource in that service in a particular region, it's tied to that region only. If you need it in a different region, then you need to go and create another one. But a global service like IAM is not a regional service, a global service. That means whatever you do affects everything, and not tied to a particular region, right? So we're going to go into a little demo here because we have a diagram here, which everyone, I believe, we can see. It shows like a Venn diagram. It shows different groups. It shows Alice, Bob, Charles. These are users within AWS that we'll be creating. It shows that 3 of them are in a group called developers. It now shows that David and Edward are in a group called operations. It also shows that Charles and David, who are in the developers group and the operations group, respectively, also they belong to the audit team group. It finally shows that Fred is a standalone, he's on his own, doesn't belong to any group. So I'll do a demo now just to show us how to implement this, right? Because in a real world scenario, you might be hired as a DevOps engineer, and from your team lead or whoever it is, this might be a requirement. It might be like, okay, we have 6 new team members joining us now. We need you to create these groups and these users for them. Create their users, add them to these particular groups, and give them certain permissions, right? So you would be able to think and design in your head that, okay, this is how it's going to play out. I'll create this group, I'll create that group. Sometimes it helps to draw out a diagram like this just to give you a visual representation of it, visual understanding of it, right? So I'll quickly bring up my AWS console so that we can have a look at what this looks like. So just give me a second to sign in here. Just hope it's not too small. Please let me know if the screen is legible enough for everyone to see. And someone, yes, okay, thank you, Sarah. All right, so this is my AWS account that I've logged into. And we've been speaking of the IAM service, Identity and Access Management, right? So I have recently visited it. That's why you see it here. If you don't see it here, you can either click View All Services or just type IAM here and it would show up, right? So we'll click IAM here to load this up for us. So good. Good. So this is what we have now. It's showing me that I have 0 users, user groups rather. I have 0 groups. I have 1 user, 8 roles, policies, and all the like. So right now, in order to implement what I just showed you on the screen, which is this, right? Don't forget, I would be creating, I would just start by creating the groups that are needed, right? So we need 3 groups. We need a developers group, we need an audit team group, and we need an operations group, right? So let's just go ahead to do that. So you would come to user groups here and just click create group. So we need developers group. The name of the group should not have spaces in between, because if it does, it would fail to create, right? So and just create that group. Now, for the developers group, I want to assign some permissions, right? So permissions on AWS are of 3 types, I would say. Broadly, there are 3 types of permissions. We're going to go through that later in the presentation, but since we are here, I just want to give a brief understanding of permissions. So permissions just define what services can be accessed, right? When you attach a particular permission to any user, is saying now that this user has this permission attached to them, they can access these services. Now, let's take, for example, this permission called Amazon EC2 read only, right? So there's a permission here called, it's called a permission policy. The permission policy here called Amazon EC2 read only. It provides access to read-only access to Amazon EC2, right? So this one is called an AWS managed permission. This means that AWS themselves created this permission and they manage it. So you can't make any changes to this permission. You can only attach it, use it how you like. The other permissions which we would create, which are called customer managed permissions. Those are the ones you create and you manage yourself. You can create, you can manage it, you can delete it if you like, right? And there's the last one called an inline permission. You will not see that permission in here. The permission is usually directly attached to the user. In this case, these permissions exist already. Let me call them policies. These policies exist. The same thing, permission policies, they exist already and we're trying to attach them. But sometimes you can just create them directly to create and attach them directly to the user. So in this case, we are creating this group called developers. And what are developers to be able to access EC2s, right? We want them to be able to have read-only access. So I'll just select this and click create group, right? So the next one we want to create is the operations group, right? So I'll create the operations group very quickly here. Just call it operations, and this time we'll give it RDS full access, right? These are just examples. Whatever permission policies you're gonna assign to the group just depends on what the requirements are, right? So let's create this two. For now, we have one more that we need, which is the audit group, right? So the audit group, will just create that here, call it audit team. I believe that's what it was called. Yeah, audit team, yes. So create that and say audit team. So we can give it permissions to, let's see, let's give it, I think we'll have security audits. Security audit permission. Yes, we'll give it a security audit permission, right? So these are predefined policies, permission policies that have been created by AWS. I've not created anything. I'm just attaching them for the purpose of this exercise. So we've created 3 groups now. We've not created any users, right? But for our different departments, we've created whatever groups they need. So to as a solutions architect, in order to implement this IAM user group solution that is displayed here, we'll need to create Alice, Bob, and Charles and add them to the developers group, right? So I'll come to users, create Alice very quickly, provide her access to the AWS Management Console. Right now, I just want to create an IAM user. You can also use something called Identity Center, but we'll get to that later. You have various options here. You can either allow AWS generate a password for you automatically, which will be printed on the screen once you're done creating this user, or you can just add your own custom password. For the sake of time, I would just add a custom password here that I can remember. There's also an option to ensure users must create a new password when they sign in. This is a security feature. So for example, if I create a user for you, maybe in DevOps Engine, I create a user for you, and I put a custom password, or even if I use an auto-generated password, at the end of the day, I will know your password because it will show up when I'm done creating. So when I tick this option here, it ensures that once I send that password to you and you log in with that password, AWS will force you to immediately change the password, right? As a security measure, so that whatever password I knew previously would no longer be valid. So for this one, I would actually just leave it ticked so that I can show how that works. So we'll go on. So it says, do you want to add a user to a group? Right. So this is what I was talking about. Now, from our diagram here, Alice is supposed to be part of the developers group. So I would just select developers here and click next. It will tell me to review the details that are set. Everything looks fine here. So I'll just click create. Right. So that's good. So if I try to log in to using this user now, let me say I log out. Just for example's sake, I sign out here. Let me sign out, then I try to log in here using the credentials it's given me. Now I say Alice, and I put this password. Just uncheck this, and I say sign in. So it will sign me in, which is fine. Then it will tell me to change my password. So this is what I was talking about. Immediately it tells me change your password. Right. So I will put the old password here. Then I'll put a new password here. Okay, awesome. So we are signed in successfully, right? Which is great. So we can see that that user works as expected. These access denied messages are normal because we only give the user a very limited amount of permissions, right, using the permission policy. So I will just sign out from this and sign back into the previous account I was using so that we can continue the demo. So I'll just show a few more things before we continue. Here, second. Sorry. Yeah. Yes. 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 Okay. Give me a second. I'm just signing in. Then I'll share again. So you should see it in a moment now. Right. So we're back in. We're back into the console. So we have seen how to just create a user, add that user to a group, ensure that the user is forced to I'm not sure you can hear me. Okay. All right. Cool. My laptop froze for a second there. Okay. Is the display too small? Can everyone confirm? And because I think I put it at a zoom of 250. So any larger and you might not see it.
It's fine, Wisdom. I already mentioned that you can enlarge on its end.
Oh, okay. 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 All right. Okay, great. So, so one other thing we will do just to showcase what we have here is, I mentioned that you can have users that are part of multiple groups. So I'll just show you how to do that. So we'll create this user Charles here, right? Or okay, let's create the user David since we already have someone in the developers team. So I would create another user David here. So David will have access and I'll give him a custom password too. Or let me just give him an auto-generated password so you see what I was talking about, right? So yes, I'll just leave this here. Create, click next. I'll add David to the operations group. And here I also have the ability to add him to the audit team group, right? So it just shows that you can have multiple groups for a single user, right? So I'll just add them to both here. And if I create, if I click create, you can see, so it shows the password here for the user, auto-generated, like I mentioned. So you're able to copy this and use it, or you're able to download it as a CSV and maybe send it to the user, right? Being the DevOps engineer in that team. So you're also able to create a user like Fred who has no group attached to him. So if we create Fred and just give him a password here, custom password this time. We click next. We don't add him to a group, and we click next. So nothing, no permissions in the permission summary. We just click create, right? So you can do whatever you need to fulfill the requirements you have in terms of creating and managing users. So as we go on through the class, I'll show you how you can assign specific, like create your own permissions and assign those permissions to the users. Right now, we're just using AWS managed permissions just for the sake of showing what those look like, right? So it's even warning me that I haven't viewed the user's password, right? But once I view it, it enables me to move ahead. So at this point, we can see that with IAM, we're able to create users, we're able to create groups, we're able to add users to groups, we're able to add users to multiple groups, and create whatever level of organization we need for our users, right? So at this point, I would just stop for a moment so that we can take some questions. I know as we've gone through this, some of you might have questions as to different scenarios in your head, or maybe something that is unclear from what I have talked about so far. So please, if you have a question, just signify by raising up your hand, and then I would give you the opportunity to unmute and ask your question. Okay, so we have Cyril here. Cyril, please go ahead and ask your question.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Okay. First, I want to ask I didn't see how you created the IAM account in the first place. You have to create an IAM account and an IAM account, right?
Do you mean the users or the groups? So by default,
Okay. Because from previous lessons, I said from previous lessons, we'll be using the root user account, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so the IAM account, you have to create that, or you can access all this from your root user account.
Yes, you can access all this from your root user account.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so secondly, I think your screen froze on me, and I didn't see much of the things you did later on. I saw how you created the user groups. I saw how you created the users, but I think I didn't see how you added the users to groups, while you assigned the users to groups. That's just it. But so far, everything you explained is clear to me.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. For that sake, I will just show again by creating one more user, Edward, and just assign him to a group just to ensure that all bases are covered, right? So I'm sure you can see my screen right now, Cyril. Okay, so I would create Edward, right? So provide Edward user access to the management console. So this just means that should Edward be able to sign into the AWS console, right? The why it's optional is sometimes you might create these users just to use them programmatically. That means you might create them so that they'll be used by other tools, not human beings. So they wouldn't need to access the console. They'll maybe just need to access the APIs or the command line or something. But in this case, we are creating a real user, right? And a human user. So I would say provide that access, and I will specify that, they are able to coming as an IAM user. So the part you didn't see was after display. So I'll just give this user a password here, and I'll untick this. I'm just creating different variations. So now this is the part where you assign the user to a group. You have various options. You can add the user to a group, copy permissions, or attach policies directly. We'll talk about those later, but for now, you just select the group, and from this diagram here, Edward is supposed to be in the operations group, right, which has a policy Amazon RDS full access. So I'll just select this group for Edward and click next. So Edward would now be part of the operations group. And once I click create user, it creates the user and automatically adds Edward to that group. So if I go back to user groups and I just reload this, if I go back to user groups and I click operations, I will see two users, David and Edward. David and Edward. So we are on track here, right? So I hope that is clear on how to add the users to the group. Okay, great. Siri, I hope that answers your question. All right, so do we have, awesome, thanks for confirming. Do we have anybody else that has a question before we move ahead? I want to ensure that everybody understands what is going on here. This is just the basic user management. So if anything is unclear, because you would definitely have to do this in your role as a DevOps engineer. You have to create and manage users, right? So if anything is unclear, please let me know so that I can clarify it and we can move forward. Because the next things we'll talk about will build on what we've learned already. So, Derek, awesome. Please go ahead. You can unmute your mic, Derek.
Yeah. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Okay, so I came into the class a bit late, but I'm trying to do some caching up really. But I wanted to find out now in creating the group, the user group. I saw that there are policies permissions. Okay, now those policies will they be, for example, I've been employed by an organization and I've been mandated to create this group. Will they make this? Would they let me know the kind of permissions to be granted to each of this group and each of these users?
Okay.
Or would that be my discretion to do?
Okay, that's a brilliant question. Thank you so much for that. So that largely depends on what role you play in the organization, right? So if, for instance, you are the DevOps manager or something, right? You are the one that makes those decisions on who gets what permissions, then you would be the one to make that decision if you are in the higher up, right? But if you are reporting to someone that has given you this task, sometimes the task might come in the form of a ticket, something we call a ticket, like a support ticket that comes in and says, we need so user, and the user needs so permissions, right? So your maybe, and the permissions might not even be defined in the way AWS defines it. The permissions might just be, this user needs to be able to access EC2s. That's what they're going to tell you. So with your DevOps knowledge, you would be able to go to your permission policies and say, okay, what kind of permissions does someone need to access EC2, right? You can check for AWS managed permissions. So AWS just creates these permissions policies to just enable their standard permissions that enables DevOps engineer work very quickly, rather than reinventing the wheel. Since it already exists, you can just use it. But if you need something more fine-grained, then you can create your own. So you would then look, okay, does this person need full access to EC2, or does this person need maybe read-only access? Then you make that decision from there, right? So just to clarify, you would have instructions on what kind of permissions to assign to the person. If it's coming in maybe as a ticket or from your manager or something, but you as a solutions architect or a DevOps engineer should also have, enough understanding of how IAM works to say, okay, if someone needs to access a particular service, these are the permissions and combination of permissions that should be assigned. So it's dependent on the scenario, and that's the summary of the answer. So I hope that helps, Derek. Awesome. Chike, please go ahead with your question.
Good evening, Wisdom.
Good evening.
Yes, thank you for, doing what you know how to do best. I just have something that I think would be very much easier for me to grasp. Now, the words, that keyword user or users, yes, I really need to understand because you just mentioned the kind of benefits or access they can have, like EC2. You understand? So my main question is, when you talk about users, are you referring to probably only people in the IT sector, or is there any broader definition of the word user as to what could be done on EC2? Probably, I don't know how I'm going to put it, but for the word user, is it like specifically for people who need IT skills, or is there any other utility that could be extended on the broader sense? I don't know if my question was able to.
Yeah, no, I understand your question. I think you just need to think about users more simply, right? As it says in the slide here, users are just people within your organization. So a user can be someone in the IT sector or not in the IT sector. A user is someone on AWS. A user is someone who needs to access a service, right? A human being. Any person that needs to access whatever service on AWS should be a user, right? So that's why we have various users here, because these are actual human beings within that organization that need to access different services. So EC2 was just one service, one of the services I use as an example, right? So a particular user might need EC2 access. Another user might not need EC2 access. Maybe that user needs RDS access, right? So same thing as, you have in an organization where there are different employees. So a user is basically an employee in this case. There are different employees in an organization who are in different departments, right? And when those employees are given their ID cards, some companies have ID cards that have RFID. That means you can scan those ID cards to enter different rooms in the different organizations. So different users have those ID cards, which are their identity cards. Of course, that's what identity card means. So it's just like here. So whoever is managing, maybe HR, they put certain permissions on those ID cards to say this user can enter the staff room or the lunch room rather, right? But this user cannot enter the CEO's office, right? So that's the concept of a user. A user is just someone that needs to access a service, just like an employee that needs to access a room within an organization. So I hope that simplifies it a bit for you. But if you are still unclear, let me know. I could.
Yes, it does. But just to be clear and sure, so you're saying that, assuming you anyhow you manage your services probably through a website, through the AWS, you could, whatever you do on the AWS could literally translate to what would now come out on the site, for instance, for people who want to have access. Is that what you mean, for instance?
Okay, so in context of a website, which you are talking about now, a website will have what you call clients, which are people accessing the site externally, right? those clients would not be people that are part of your internal team, because you are a DevOps engineer, maybe you have a DevOps team and all that. Okay. So when I speak of users here, I'm not talking about the clients. I'm talking about the people within your team, right? Okay, the people internally. Yes, the team of developers, the team of operation in the operations team, the HR team. Yeah, so the people at the back end, not the people accessing the service. Yeah.
Okay. Very clear now. Thank you.
All right. Awesome. Thank you for that question. So, because of time, we would move on to the next slide, so that we can cover everything. I'm glad everyone, is getting a good grasp of users and groups, because the concept is very fundamental to what we're trying to learn as DevOps engineers. Right. So I've been speaking of permissions and permission policies, right? So a policy in AWS, an IAM policy, it defines permissions for actions on AWS resources, right? It defines the access that users can have on AWS resources. So a user might have, you can grant a user, for example, the permission to start an EC2 and stop an EC2, right? You can grant them the permission to create an EC2, but you can restrict them from being able to delete an EC2. So those are different kind of permissions that you can give. So it depends on the actions you want users to be able to take on AWS resources, right? And permissions can be attached to users, groups, or roles, right? I would explain what roles are as we proceed in the class, but we're just focusing on users and groups now. So you can attach permissions to users and groups. From the examples we've done, I showed how to attach policies, permission policy. I'll use them interchangeably because they mean the same thing. To attach permission policies to users or groups. So policies just define or determine what actions the members of a group can perform, such as reading data or stopping an EC2, like I mentioned, right? So there are three types of policies that I mentioned previously. Managed policies, that's like AWS managed policies, customer managed policies, and inline policies. If we want to make it broader, we can say only two types and say managed policies and inline policies. Managed ones are the ones that are already created and they're just existing there waiting for you to attach it. Inline policies are the ones that you don't create them separately. You only attach them directly to the user. That means once it's attached to that user, it's not even available for another user to make use of it. So the beauty of creating policies is that it can be reused. I create a policy, one user uses it, one group uses it. I can add it to 100 groups, however I like, right? So the managed policies are standalone policies that can be attached to multiple groups. Inline policies are attached directly to a single user group or role. They are not shared among users. So I would demo that after this slide. So we also have something called group policy inheritance, right? Group policy inheritance. So from what we've done, we created multiple groups. We created multiple users. We added some users to multiple groups. Now, as you can see here on my mouse, someone like Charles and David are peculiar people within this structure because Charles is in two groups at the same time. Charles is in developers group and audit team at the same time, audit team group at the same time. David is in operations group and audit team group at the same time. But you see, Alice and Bob, they are just in developers group and Edward is just in operations group, right? Or we can call them departments, whichever one. So in this case now, developers group has its own permissions here, which is represented by these red check marks here. an audit team group has its own permissions. That means Charles is going to be inheriting 2 permissions, right? So think of inheritance like you would normally. Let's say, you know, the father has a child, and say the father passes away, whatever properties, you know, because the child is the son of, you know, that particular person, whatever properties that person has is inherited. So inheritance just speaks of what you get as a result of your association with something. So because Charles is associated to developers, he gets the permissions that is attached to developers. Because he's also associated to audit team, he gets the permissions that are attached to audit team. That's just called policy inheritance, right? Or permission inheritance, right? Yes, so I would demo that also shortly so you can just see how that works, because there are times where the permissions are clashing. So I might have, in developers, I might have the permission to, you know, start an EC2. Maybe I'm allowed to start an EC2, right, in the developers group, but maybe in the audit group, there's an explicit permission that says, stop, don't allow this person to start an EC2. Right, so we have the concept of deny and allow, which we'll talk about shortly. So I might be allowed in developers, but denied in the audit team, right? So in such situation, there's something called a policy preference. So now we're talking about group policy inheritance. So Charles is able to inherit 2 different policies from 2 different groups, right? One says allow him to start EC2. One says deny him from starting EC2. So policy precedence, in this case, says that an explicit deny will override any allow. And I'll explain what that means. Explicit deny means that the permission policy that was created says deny this person, like explicitly, it's not implicit. It says deny this person from doing this action. So if there's an explicit deny in any group or any policy, permission policy that the user is attached to, that is clashing with an explicit allow or an implicit allow, whatever, the explicit deny would always take precedence. So in this case, even though Charles might have the permission to start an EC2 because of the allow policy on the developers group, being that there's a deny policy on the audit group, it will not be allowed, right? And I will still demo that. I know that might be a bit confusing as you're hearing it, but what you can just take from that is a deny always overrides an allow. A deny always overrides an allow. Because when you're taking the exam, they will give you such examples. They'll give you a policy that says, allow the user to create an S3 bucket. Then in that same policy, it will also say, deny that same user from creating an S3 bucket. They will now ask you, what would be the result when this user tries to create an S3 bucket? The result will be that the user will be unable to create the S3 bucket because the deny will always take the precedence over the allow, right? So I hope that makes some sense. So we've already talked about, you know, different group memberships, multiple roles. We've talked about inline policies. So I'll just do a quick demo here regarding the policy inheritance, right? Group policy inheritance. Don't forget, policy inheritance just means what permissions do I get? The permissions I get based on the groups that I belong to. So I inherit those permissions because those permissions are not attached. If we're speaking about group policy inheritance, those permissions are not attached directly to the user. They are attached to the group. So as a reason of by the reason of the user being part of that group, he inherits those permissions, right? it doesn't mean that you cannot attach permissions directly to the user also, right? So let's look at a quick demo for this. So we have various users that we've created here. We've created Alice. So David has 2 groups he belongs to, right? 2 groups here, audit and operations. And we see that the audit team has this permission policy, security audits attached to them. And the operations team have this permission policy, RDS, full access attached to them. Now, when you look at the permissions that David has, you see that he has 2 permissions because he has inherited those permissions from 2 different groups. But if we go back to another user, in this case, Alice is part of what group here? The developers group. You see that Alice has just 1 permission because our group, only has 1 permission. So Alice inherited 1 permission. So what we'll do is to create some permissions policies that cause a user to have that clash. Then we'll see where the explicit deny comes in, right? So let me create a new group called, let me create a new group here just to demonstrate this. Let's just say this group is called S3 management. Or no, let me just call this group the DevOps group, right? Let me call this group DevOps. Might be easier. Okay, so in the DevOps group, I'm gonna say give S3 full access. So S3 full access here ensures that the user is able to access every S3 content, right? Buckets and the objects in them. So I would attach that permission to that group, right? So I'll create that group called DevOps. Then I would create a user called Wisdom and add Wisdom to that particular group. So creating Wisdom, select our user options here. I want to give Wisdom a password I can remember so that I can easily log in. I don't need him to change the password. So click next, and it's asking me to add the user to a group. I now add the Wisdom to the DevOps group, and I create the user, right? That's all successful. So we'll go back to my user Wisdom. So Wisdom is part of one group and has S3 full access. But now I'm going to create something called inline permission policy, right? If you remember, I mentioned managed permissions are standalone and can be attached to multiple groups, but inline are attached directly to a user or to a group. So I'm going to attach this inline permission policy directly to Wisdom, right? So it's asking me what service, specify what actions can be performed on specific resources. So it's just saying I should select the service that I want to grant permissions to for Wisdom. So the service I want to grant permissions to here is S3. And I want to deny Wisdom from doing all permissions on S3, right? So I'll just click all here for the sake of this example, right? So it's a deny. If you remember previously, when we created the DevOps group, we put an allow. We said allow full access, but here I'm putting a deny directly on Wisdom just to show what the explicit deny can do. So what will I call this policy? I'll just call it something descriptive, deny S3 access. Excuse me, S3 access. Right. So I'll create this policy. All right. So we see here two conflicting policies. One says allow S3 full access. The other one says deny S3 access. So let's see which one will win. Right. So what I'm going to do here is to sign out of this my current account and sign in using Wisdom. Let's see. So this should be okay. Wisdom and the password. We sign in, successful, awesome. So now let's see what's going to happen when I go to the S3 console and I try to access various things. Let's see if I'm allowed or if I'm denied. So if I click S3 here, we would see that I get, it's just taking a bit of time to load. All right, cool. So S3 buckets. So you see, it says you don't have any permissions, right? So basically I got denied because the explicit deny that I attached to the user wisdom took higher precedence than the allow, right? And that's how it always works. When there's a clash, when there's a deny on a particular permission on a particular resource, and there is an allow permission on the same resource for the same user or maybe a group, the one that denies will always take precedence over the allow. So you should keep that in mind when you are creating permission or assigning permission. So if I log out of this user now and I go and revert what I did, that means I remove the explicit deny, you would see that the user would now have access. Okay, so we're back into my root user here and my root counts. So I come back to IAM and I look for my user wisdom. So this is wisdom here. I go in, and once I go into wisdom, I can see that wisdom still has that explicit deny. So I can just click here and say remove that policy. So once I remove that policy, now I only have, allow permissions, right? You can see it says allow. So what I'll do now is I would log out again, log in as Wisdom and see if anything changes. So let's do a sign in here. I want to use this account, Wisdom, sign in, great. So if I then go to the S3 bucket again with Wisdom, let's see if I still get denied. All right, so this time I'm not denied. I'm able to see the S3 bucket. I'm able to view the contents of different things in the buckets here, as you can see, right? So that just goes to show that explicit deny did take effect when we set it up, right? So like I mentioned, whenever you are creating policies, you need to keep that in mind, that an explicit deny would always take precedence over an explicit allow. Now, so within the DevOps culture, IAM policy inheritance is very critical, right? Because it helps us ensure that the principle of least privilege is always followed by enabling specific permissions to only those who need them for their role, right? So for instance, if you have someone that his job is just to run a particular pipeline, CI/CD pipeline, you can just grant him permission to only that pipeline and nothing else. So you can put him in a group and maybe call the group pipeline group and add that user there and attach permissions to run only that pipeline, right? So we ensure that there's no security breach. So one day, if the employee just gets angry with the whole company and decides that he wants to tear down the cloud infrastructure, wants to, scatter everything, it does not have permissions to, because least privilege has been followed and can only access that one pipeline only, right? So that's where security breaches are avoided, right? So because of time, I'll just talk us through the last slide here for today, which is the structure of the policies, right? And then I'll take questions before we round up. So this is the typical structure of an IAM permission policy, right? So policies are like a set of rules in a game, right? Each rule dictates what players, in this case users, can or cannot do within the game. And in this case, the game is the AWS environment. So when you write a policy, it's basically dictating who can do what and who cannot do what. It's usually written in, or always written in, a JSON format, right? JSON just means JavaScript Object Notation. It's a structured format that humans and computers understand. It might look a bit strange if you've never worked with it before, but it's quite easy to understand, right? And as you work with it, it would make more sense. So I'll just talk about the components of this policy. So you see different things here. You see some brackets, some are square, some are curly. You see version ID and all these things. So we'll go through all of them and understand what each one of them means. So for every IAM policy you want to create, there always has to be a version, right? It's always good to put a version. A version, in this case, it's called a policy language version. It defines the syntax that AWS would use to interpret your policy. So this is something that AWS requires more than you do, really. And the latest version is 2012, is the 17th of October, 2012, right? And all you need to do is just to write version column, as you see it here, version in double quotes, column, and the date in double quotes. So don't think too much about this, wondering, oh, will I ever need to change the version? You probably not ever need to change the version. It's almost always going to be 2012. It has been like this for about 12 years. We've always used this. AWS hasn't yet released a new policy language version. So don't worry too much about this. If they do release it, they will announce it, and you would be able to change it, right? So version would always be this, what you see. So when you're writing JSON, one interesting thing about JSON is when you write a line, you would usually need to put a comma after it, right? There are some cases where you don't need to put a comma if there's nothing else following it within that particular curly bracket. So these ones are the curly brackets. So you can see here that there is a comma here. You can see here in this resource that there is no comma here because it's just closing up, right? So you use a comma to separate each line. You can read more on the JSON format, during your spare time. It's an interesting format that is used in a lot of DevOps tools. So it's good to just have an idea of, what it means and how it works, right? So, but basically here, we'll start with the version. Then the next thing we'll do is to write out something called an ID. So an ID, identifier, is like a name tag for your policy. It's optional, you don't need to put it, but it helps in distinguishing your policy. So when you create an ID, what you should normally do, when you create a policy rather, what you should normally do is to give it an ID that describes what your policy is actually doing, right? As you can see on the screen, this one just says S3 account permission. If you even want it to be more specific, you can call this ID allow access to S3, right? What I usually do sometimes is just put the action, then put the service, maybe allow access to S3 or allow get put to S3, depending on whatever you want. But you need to make it something that is descriptive, something that will describe what that policy is to you. So at a glance, because within a permission, an IAM policy, rather, within an IAM policy, you might have multiple blocks of permission, right? Right here, we just have one block here. You might have multiple blocks. So you would want to ensure that each of them has their ID. And that ID describes what exactly that particular permission can do. So at the heart of this policy, there is something called a statement. A statement is where the actual permissions are defined, right? It's like the chapter in the rule book, where each chapter explains a different permission. So you can have multiple statements within a particular policy, right? So each statement has something called an SID. An SID is similar to an ID, but SID just means statement ID. The first one just means identifier ID. But since this is within a statement, SID just means statement ID. So statement ID can be whatever you want again. It's also optional, just like the ID. In this case, it's one that is there. Now, the next thing is the effects. Effects can only be two options. There are only two things you can put on that effect, either allow or deny. Effect speaks of the permission you want to grant to a particular resource. Do you want whoever is using this permission to be able, this policy to be able to access it or not access it? So if you want them to access it, you put an allow. If you want to deny them access, you put a deny there, right? So it's just like having, traffic signals. You have a green light to go, you have a red light to stop. So as a DevOps engineer, you control what users can access by setting that effect there as allow or deny. So the principal here, specifies who this policy applies to. So we've specified the action, which is allow in this case. Then now the principal will specify who this policy applies to, right? In this case, we are saying the policy applies to the root user, right? Now, this set of characters you are seeing here, ARN, AWS, IAM, whatever, that is called let me just sign in here to show you. That's called the ARN of a user, right? It's an Amazon resource name. So every resource, be it a user, an EC2 instance, they always have a specific unique user resource name rather, which always starts with ARN. So that is what is here. So ARN would just usually have ARN, then AWS, which is the platform itself, then the service name, which is IAM here, right? So ARN, AWS, IAM. Then this is usually the account number, right? So each AWS account has an account number. So this would be the account number, then the username. So the username here is root, right? So principal just if the user resource rather that, excuse me, if the person or the user that you want to access a resource is an AWS user, right? You would have AWS here. Then you have the user ARN. I know in your mind, you're probably thinking, is there any situation where we'll be granting permissions to someone that is not an AWS user? Yes, there are more advanced scenarios where you can grant permissions to users outside of AWS or permissions to tools outside of AWS, right? But those are rare occurrences, right? And as you progress in the course, you know, in your learning, you'll get to come across some of those situations. But for now, 95 or 99% of the time, you would always have AWS here. On the left side of the principal, then you have the Amazon resource name, the user's ARN on the right side. So the next thing is the action. The action speaks to the specific operations that the principal can perform or not, right? So to recap again, effect speaks of whether the person, the principal is allowed to do something or not. The principal just speaks of who that particular policy applies to, while the action speaks of specific operations that the principal can perform or not perform. Then lastly, the resource. The resource speaks to the AWS resources that this policy applies to, right? So in this case, we can see that the policy is applying to an S3 bucket. So it doesn't apply to an EC2 or RDS in this case, just an S3 bucket, right? And lastly, we have something called conditions, which is optional, but it's not displayed in this particular slide. So conditions are just are the specific requirements for the policy to be in effect, right? A condition can be, for example, it can be something like, if this user is part of a particular group, then all these permissions should apply, right? There are different kind of permissions you can do, conditions you can do, but that is also a very more advanced topic. You would usually not need to have use conditions. So this is the basic structure of a policy, a permission policy. And I'll do a quick demo for us again, just to show how we can build our own from scratch, like we can write our own permission policy based on everything that we've learned here, how we can write this exact policy. So I'm gonna sign in here back into my account as we've done in previous times. Okay, we're back into the account, and we'll go to the IAM console. Then we'll go to policies. So previously we've used a managed policy. We've also created an inline policy where we did the explicit deny. For now, we are going to create a managed policy also, but this time a customer managed policy, not AWS managed policy. So now we have the policy editor. We actually use this, if you notice previously, where we can just select the different services we want and the permissions we want. But in this case, we're going to change this and use JSON, right? So when we put JSON, you can see it defines something that is very similar to the structure that we have here, right? So it's missing the ID. So I can just come here and add, excuse me, and add ID and say, it will tell you if there's an error while you're typing, but I'm not yet done. So it won't know. You see, once I do this, the error disappears. So like I said, there has to be that comma here. If not, it will tell you that there's an error in the syntax. So now we can create something similar to what we see here. I can call this S3 account permissions, right? Then let's just leave this as statement 1. That's fine. Then in the actions, so remember effects is either allow or deny, right? So I can put, you can even see that if I change this to anything other than allow or deny, it already gives an error. It says invalid effect. So once I write deny here, the error disappears. So if I write allow and I spell it wrongly, there's an error here, right? So AWS is going to help you ensure that you write the correct thing in your permissions, right? So the action here, we had 2 actions. We have S3. So the action will usually start with the service name, in this case S3. Then the particular action you want to perform on that service. So get objects, right? You don't have to necessarily memorize all these things. You can always look at the AWS documentation. Trust me, I do that a lot, right? I don't spend my time memorizing some of these things. I just understand what they mean. Of course, once you use them consistently, you become more familiar with them. But you can always look at the AWS documentation, and you can always use, the visual one. There are many options. You can just Google it. Being a DevOps engineer is not about memorizing stuff. It's just about knowing how things work and knowing where to find what you need, knowing what to use, when you need to accomplish something. So if we wanted to, work on EC2s, we would do something like EC2 here and maybe start EC2 if there's a permission like that, right? But in this case, we are doing S3, get objects. So there's a comma here, get objects. Then I'll put a comma. Then we also want to do S3 put objects, right? This one can add a comma or not, whichever one is fine. Okay, it doesn't want a comma, so that's good. So now we talked about the principal, right? That's something we've not added. So can just put the principal here, and we can say the principal is, in this case, let's see, who did we use here? Okay, so we had this, then we had AWS first, I believe. Then we had this, right? Did we have a comma somewhere? Great, add a comma here. So now, similar to what we have there, what we need to do is just fill in the actual principal here. So it's saying unsupported principal. That's fine. It's because we are not done filling it yet. So let's see. So if I just open a new tab here for the users, because I want to use an existing user ARN like I showed you. So let's say the person I want to assign these permissions to is, let's just pick Alice here, for instance. So I'll pick Alice's ARN here. You see it. I'll just do this and copy, right? Or I can just hit this button here. It copies it. Then I can come here and paste ARN here, right? So it's still showing an error. Okay, that's fine. Let's see why exactly it's showing an error. So we can see that we have the effect, then we have the principal, right? Then we close. Then we have the ARN index. So we should be good, but we'll just proceed. Let's proceed to the resource, then we'll come back to that. Now, in the resource, we would be putting the S3 bucket where we want this particular actions to apply to, right? So what resource do we want Alice to be able to get the objects in and put objects into, right? So in this case, we're just gonna have, we'll get the ARN for the S3 bucket also. Let me grab one. One that already exists. So let's look at one of our buckets. We can just use this elastic one for an example. Let's see. Just trying to get the ARN. Yeah, should be under. Yes, see it here. Okay, so this is the ARN here. I'll pick that up. Come over here. Can also paste that in. And so when you're doing a get objects or put objects in this case, you would want to put a slash and an asterisk in front of the bucket name, right? That's because the put object and the get object, they apply, this specific example that I'm giving, these two permissions apply to the object inside the bucket, not the bucket itself. So by putting this asterisk, you are saying, let it apply to every object, like this is a wildcard, apply to every object inside that bucket, right? So it's saying the policy type identity policy does not support the principal. Okay, it doesn't support the principal in this case. Let's see if there's anything we want to change there. All right, so another way we can work around this actually is rather than having the principal directly defined here, we can create this policy, then just attach it to the user. That's another way to work around this. So if I click next in this place, and I would have to give this policy a name. So I would call this policy maybe something similar to what we gave the ID. I'll say S3 accounts permissions for Alice. Or rather than making it specifically for Alice, I'll just leave it as S3 account permission so that I can use it for any other user. So I can put a description here. This policy grants get and get objects, input objects to on the S3 buckets, right? So something like this. So the description is just to help you remember what exactly that policy does. And if I create this policy, you can see that it's created successfully. Now, if I search for that policy there, S3 account, you see what I was saying previously, that this shows up as customer managed, while almost every other permission here shows up as AWS managed, right? Customer managed just means that you created that permission and you manage it, right? So we can see how we're able to create our own policies from scratch, write out exactly what permissions we need. Now we can take this policy as it is and attach it, right? We can say we want to attach this policy to Alice here. And we attach the policy. And once we do that, Alice would be able to inherit that policy and be able to get and put objects into that particular bucket, right? So we can see that Alice has inherited that policy. So that is the policy, IAM policy structure, right? It just enables us have so much flexibility in creating and defining what policies we want specifically for our users. And one last thing I'll just show us before I take questions and we round up for today is the fact that you can create multiple policies. Have multiple statements in a single policy. It's not just one statement, right? So if I wanted to have another statement here in this block, what I'll just do is to come here and say statements again, right? Then start a new block here, right? So once I start that new block, I'll be able to write out the JSON. Let's say, let me just use this as an example. I copy all these things, I put it in here, then maybe put a comma here. Now, let me put this so that I show you something, right? So the error here is saying there is a JSON error, right? So we'll just put another ID here to ensure that it changes to something else. We can see, let's say, S3. Oh no, rather than doing that, let's do this, right? So for the statements here, let's see if you can just have a separate block. Okay, yes. So that's what I wanted to show you. So instead of having to write the whole statement block again, if you want to create a new statement, like I mentioned, you can just put I'll just clear this up so that it's clearer for you, right? So this was what we had before. If you want to add a new statement, you can just put a comma and an order another curly brackets, then begin to write everything that you need in your statement, the SID, and all those kind of things, right? So you have the opportunity to do as many statements as you want within a single policy. And I think we'll just round it up here for now in the demo and take some questions. I can see Stephen already has his hands up. So if there's anybody else that has some questions, please do raise your hand and I'll grant you permissions to speak. So Stephen, please go ahead with your question.
Good evening, Mr. Wisdom, or morning, or wherever you are.
Yes,
everyone. Okay, the question I want to ask is, as regard the permission thing, that is it possible, just like where Charles is, for example, he has the permission for developers and that of auditing, right? So is it possible, even why others, David permission on auditing is different from that of Charles permission on auditing, is it possible?
Okay, so when you have a team, okay, go on.
No, I'm saying that that Charles and David is to audit and operations, while Charles is to developers and audit. So now, is it that it's possible to have Charles, you can access the auditing policies, but then you have limited to you have some certain things you can access in that particular bucket, and then as well as David, they can both access different things. You cannot access what Charles can access in auditing, but then Charles cannot access what David can access in auditing. Is it possible?
Yes, of course, it's possible. IAM allows you to create a very fine-grained policy, like define it as much as you want, right? So the thing to keep in mind is when you create a policy and you attach it to a group, everybody in the group inherits that same policy, exactly what that group has, right? Every user inherits that policy. But when you want to limit what each person can do and make it different, like you said, that is when you begin to create policies and attach them directly to the user, right? Or maybe the policy might come from another group. Let's say audit team, for instance, says everybody can access a bucket. But being that David is part of the operations team says anybody in the operations team is denied from accessing that same bucket. Explicit deny will ensure that David cannot access the bucket, but Charles can access the bucket just because David has inherited permissions that deny him access from operations, while Charles does not have that inheritance. So he's only going to take the allow permissions that comes from audits, right? So you can do that on the group level. You can also do that directly to David and say, we don't want David to access this bucket. So we just create a deny and we attach it directly to David, while everybody else in audits can access that bucket. Does that make sense?
That's also my question. But then where I'm still going is that in that same bucket, you can access the bucket, but then still have some certain thing that you can still do. That's what I mean. Like I can access
certain things you cannot still do inside the bucket.
Yes, inside the bucket, yes.
Yeah, sure. Like accessing a bucket. So from here, we created these permissions that say it can a user can read and write, right? So if we give him permissions to read, for instance, and we give another user permission to read write, on that bucket, we can also say, okay, let me put it this way. We can say that Charles can only access certain objects within the bucket. That's how fine-grained it is. I guess what I'm trying to say is what you are saying is possible. You just need to define it. It depends on what exactly you need to do. Like you said, can he access some things and not access other things? My question to you would be, what are the things you want him to access? What are the things you don't want him to access, right? Are they objects? Are they buckets? Are they certain file names and all those kind of things? So you can define all those things within the permission policy and say, Charles can access so, but is denied from accessing so, right? All those things are possible within. And what you would use to do that is the is the resource here, all right? So by the time you're writing your resource, you can write the name of your bucket, then you can write the name of the file that is allowed to access, or the name of the file that you want to deny him from accessing, right? So okay. Does that help?
Yeah, that's very clear. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for that question. We'll go very quickly. Chike, please, you can unmute and ask a question.
Okay, thank you. Just because of time, can you, is there any way you can describe the S3, the bucket list, in the context that you said it, but I mean, so that you can have some kind of, I can make better sense of it, because I don't know, it seems the S3 is the part that it's a bit gray. Is it like something that everyone should know? Because I'm a novice in tech,
Yeah, so the interesting thing is S3, I just use this as an example here to explain. S3 is a service, right? It's a service that allows people to store files, right? It's a storage service on AWS. But S3 is still later down in our course, right? No, actually, it's the next week's topic. So we're going to dive deep into S3 next week. So I just use S3 as an example of a service you can access, just the same way you do maybe for an EC2, right? So it's not something you need to know too deeply right now. You can go and Google about it, but by next week we will dig deep into it. So these permissions that we're talking about, it just talks about, oh, what can I do on a particular service? And from this example here, it's just saying I can get some objects or I can add some objects. Get objects just means you're able to read a file within the S3, right? The S3 storage. And to put object means you're able to write a file, add a new file into the S3 storage. So that's what those permissions are talking about in this context. But you don't really need to know, in depth of S3 now because we've not spoken about it. But by next week, we will definitely dive deep into that. Okay,
thank you. And sorry, you also mentioned in the area for the section for the actions, where you said get object. You now said that we need to go and read up the AWS. How can we access such information on the AWS?
Like okay, so you can. Yes, so you can always search. I mean, you can just Google it. You can look for AWS policies, right? For instance, and you can Google that. See, maybe I can drop this link on here, and I'm sure it's in your. If you check in your the things that you are advised to read further for this particular course, I'm sure it's also in there, but I can drop it in the chat. You can go and read more on permission policies if you want to, get a deeper understanding of that. Is that okay?
Very well. Thank you so much.
All right. You're welcome. We have 2 questions left before we round up. So Derek, please go ahead.
Good evening once more, Wisdom, and everybody.
Good evening.
So at a point, I think I got lost, I must confess. Okay, so that was the point you were showing us all of these mathematical elements. Okay, so I don't know. I don't know if there is any other way any other platform we can actually get to familiarize ourselves with them, because they are looking so foreign, so alien to me right now. So from this point forward, I just couldn't complain nothing. Yeah.
Okay, so I no, that's absolutely fine. I believe you are speaking of this particular slide, right?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right. So the link I dropped in the chat, you can get more information about this there, but you can just read this slide to be shared. So you can just read through this one. It's actually just all we are describing here is the structure of a policy, right? We talked about how policies enable certain actions on certain resources for certain users, right? So this is how AWS enables us to define a policy using a JSON format like we've shown here, right? We state the statements, the IDs, the effect, which is allow or deny, principal, which is the AWS user that is supposed to have the permissions that are being defined, right? The actions are what permissions are actually being given to. So if we are saying an allow, the allow is saying allow this action for this principal on this resource, right? So that's basically is a way of writing English differently. Let me put it in that way. So you're saying, for instance, allow this action on this resource for this user. Or if you put deny here, saying deny these actions on this resource or resources, it could be more for this particular user. So you could just, go through this slide again, and also you could look at the IAM console here, right? Just play around with it, try to add a new permission, right? And see what that looks like. So rather try to create a new permission policy here. And it will tell you when you're having errors. Even as soon as you click create and you click JSON here, it will give you a very, like a schematic, a way, a blueprint rather, that you can use to start to define your own permission. So it's totally normal if you've never worked with JSON before for this to look like some mathematical construct. You just need to, work with it a bit, then it becomes more familiar. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay, so just before I go, I'm seeing somebody, saying that please where of course it's live. So this is actually my first class after the onboarding. So I don't know if it's actually the right core that I belong, because I got onboarded on Saturday. So that's this is my first class, first live class I'm attending. So am I in the right?
No,
right
you're
cohort,
not. You're
so
not
I'm
in
not
the
right.
class. No.
Okay.
So however you got into this class, we need to look into the process that brought you here. You shouldn't be in this class. Yeah. So you can reach out to me on Slack, and then I'll take it up from there.
Name, please.
All right.
Darren.
Name, please. Name.
Darren.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, just like Darren.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, Derek, thanks. I'm very glad you asked that question. You even did well to assimilate all that we did so far, even though you
so
went ahead
now,
of
right?
yourself. Yeah, that's all right.
But
please make sure to reach out to Dari so that he can put you in the right class next time. Okay. Gift, please go ahead with your question. You can unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
So I would like to ask, I'm not sure if I'm using the right nomenclature, but is there anything like an action precedence for resources? You mentioned something like if someone is in two groups, maybe a developer and operations, and assuming developers are allowed a resource and operations is not allowed a resource, and someone is both a developer and an operations person, how will
that situation be
know
resolved?
which policy to apply, whether it's allow or deny? Thank you.
Okay, that's a brilliant question. We did speak about that a bit in this slide. It's the concept of inheritance and policy precedence, right? That was what you were speaking about. So the policy precedence in AWS is that an explicit deny always overrides an allow, right? So if in a particular group where a user belongs to, there are permissions there to allow access to a resource, and in a second group that the user belongs to, there are permissions there to deny access to a resource. The deny will always take precedence over the allow. That's the general rule, right? On AWS, and to be honest, on all cloud platforms, denies always take precedence over the allow. So I hope that clarifies it for you, Gift.
Okay. So what of in a case where you want somebody to be in those two groups, but you want him to have access to something that in the other group is not allowed? Are you going to create another? How will you now make that work?
So in that case, that person should not be in the group where is denied. That means that person needs a different set of permissions, like a custom set of permissions, right? So what you would do is to take that person out of the group that is denying him what he needs permissions to, right? And create a custom set of permissions for the person to access what he needs to access. Because as long as he's in the group that denies him, he would not be able to access those resources, right?
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. That's a great question. All right, time is fast spent. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Thank you for your questions in the chat, your questions by voice. I hope this class has brought a lot of value to you. So I would encourage you that you read a bit more, based on the learning materials that have been given to you. Try these things out in your projects. As you do this, we learn by doing here. Basically, it's project-based learning. So as you do, whatever knowledge you get here gets, deeper into your mind. You have a deeper understanding of it. So I'll see you guys next week. I'll just check with Sumilara if you have any information from them before we dismiss.
Okay.
Have any info for them?
No, not at all for me. Thank you very much. Just a point of reminder as well. You know, if you have pending projects that you haven't completed, please complete them. Your learning path, videos, quizzes, whatever, complete them. If your next module has not been enabled, let us know. You should have another module enabled for the next period of tutorials. So, all right. Thank you very much, guys.
Okay.
Have a nice weekend.
All right. Thank you. I see Cyril has a question here. It says, where are the slides shared? Tumnara, could you advise him on where he can access the slides? Okay, I believe the slides would be available on your portal. Sorry, Dari, correct me if I'm wrong. For each student.
At the moment, we haven't actually implemented putting the slides in the portal. So what we'll do is we'll make sure the slides is shared with you on Slack for now. That's the best we can do for now.
Okay.
We'll put it in the Slack, but in future iteration of our development, we'll try and make sure that we also have it on the portal for you. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you, Cyril. So you get the slides on Slack. Bolaji has a question. It says he needs an advice. He needs to know. You know, I know we have a lot to learn at the moment. I've been learning so many things in bits like Linux, Bash. Now AWS, the advisable to just stick to one. Oh, as a DevOps engineer, you have to embrace it all. We are teaching you all the little things that work together to ensure that you have like well-rounded skills to work in the DevOps engineer role, right, in the DevOps space. So it's not a case of sticking to one, it's a case of embracing all, but it's a step by step. You need to devote some time to it, to just go over the content we've learned and, you know, just try it out, test it out on your laptop or on the cloud, and just ensure you're always ahead of the class. Because if you are behind, it will always feel like there's so many things happening. But if you are able to keep yourself ahead in a situation where you've already gone through, you know, the course material for this particular class before we even came into the class, then, you know, it should be easier for you to sink in. But yes, don't worry, everything comes together. Derek, please go on.
If I can add to that, what you will notice is even though you're getting exposed to Linux, Bash, Shell, and all that, we're not going deep into them, right? We're not saying you have to be an expert in Linux and then become an expert in Bash or Shell or whatever. Sure. So we're just taking them in bits on the surface and then trying, your capstone project will try to connect the dots together on the level that you are. And the same concept is going to continue even in your advanced class. So the same Linux that you're doing right now, you're still going to meet it again in almost every step of the way that you're going. You still get to do things on Bash. You still get to do things on AWS on different elements. So, you know, you will continue to learn in this manner, you know, different tools, and then we'll combine them together at different levels. So all of them on the basic level, all of them on another level later on, you know, and that's just the way it is, you know. So this is a profession that needs different tools to get the job done, right? And the best way to teach you the different tools is to introduce them to you at different levels as you go along. So nothing too complex at the moment, just, you know, enjoy them as you go along. If you meet something new, you learn it on Linux. You meet something new on AWS again, you quickly learn it. All those bits and pieces of information, they will come together as you go. And that's just the way it is. Okay.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Chike says, how can we access the lecture outline to know what to expect for the next class? I already gave a hint that, you know, we are doing S3, but I believe if Dari wants to speak to that, but like,
so
it should be available.
Okay, so what we'll do is I'll take note of that as well. I'm sure we have a PDF that actually shows the curriculum, but The best hint will be more of your learning path. Okay, so just try to be ahead of the class by going through your courses and the project and whatever. But two things I'm taking out of this class now is first of all, I think we talked about. Oh, I can't remember now. I'm trying to remember. Okay, there's someone that's not supposed to be in this class that I need to get out. So that's the first action for me. So the next action is to try and get the full curriculum document for you. It's three. The third one is to get you the PowerPoint slides over to you. So I've taken note of those three actions. I'll work on them, and then I guess that will help you if you have.
Thank you so much. Please, if you need anything else outside of this class, just ping on the Slack channel, and you have everything that you need. We're here to aid your learning as much as possible, so that you can become what you have set out to become, which is a DevOps engineer and a professional one at that. So thank you, everyone, for joining the class today. I'll see you next week. Have a good evening or morning, wherever you are. Bye.
Thanks, Mikram. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye.